The game I featured from round 8 of the Tata Steel tournament was Richard Rapport against Magnus Carlsen. Somehow that had great significance for the tournament. But, you know, there's in each round there are so many great games that are played, and in particular in round 8 I was struck by the game between Levon Aronian and Anish Giri. Aronian with the white pieces, and well, not only was I completely impressed by Aronian's middle game play, but also the opening is of some interest to me because it's a Catalan, and Giri played this variation with bishop b4 check that I recommend on one of my DVDs, A Repertoire for Black Against the Catalan. And Aronian produced a very interesting novelty with white. So let's see what happens. So bishop d2 is the main move. And now, in a previous round in Tata Steel, we saw Magnus retreat the bishop to d6, which I go into on the DVD. It's an interesting sideline. But the main move is bishop e7. And somehow that's more typical of Giri's style. He's quite orthodox. And c6. Okay, so this is a normal closed Catalan, except the bishop is on d2. Why has black induced this bishop move? Well, it doesn't sit particularly well on d2 actually, because it rather gets in the way of the knight. One thing that white would like to do is play knight d2, queen c2 and e4, and obviously with the bishop on d2 instead of c1 that's not possible. And when the knight goes to c3, well, you know, that could be just a free pawn. So this bishop, well, often it's better on b2, and if it goes to f4 sometimes that's a bit vulnerable. So this is the idea of just dragging this bishop to d2, and the most normal move here is to play queen c2 to protect the c pawn. This has been played in well, thousands of games actually. But instead of that, after no thought at all, Aronian played knight a3, and this incredibly is a novelty. Aronian said he thought of this move about a year ago. He also said it's not very good, but it's the kind of thing that I think is ideally suited to play against Giri, because Giri is such an orthodox player, and something that's a little bit offbeat, particularly when it's reasonably sound, is, well, I think a good strategy against Giri, and which was proved by the game continuation. Okay, so why knight a3? Well, Aronian explained afterwards this is really directed against b6. So this, as is the case in many d5 openings, is the problem piece. How do you get out that bishop? Well, normally it comes out via b7 or a6. But Aronian explained that actually the knight is pretty well placed on a3 because it leaves the c-file open, and sometimes there's a chance to go into b5, sometimes c4. So, for example, after knight e5, white is looking to take here and play knight b5, for example. But if normal move knight d7, then you can take on d5. If pawn takes, well, it might be possible to play knight b5 immediately. You can certainly play this, and you can support the rook very easily, and that knight will have a chance to go into b5 as well. So after pawn takes d5, then knight e5, and if this, then knight c4, and the knight magically comes to a really good position, supporting the e5 pawn, but also looking at that square on d6. So there is method in his madness. So Giri played knight d7. He wasn't going to get involved with those lines with b6. Rook c1. So Aronian looking possibly to open the c-file at some stage. And now Giri played knight e4, so he's not thinking about the development of this bishop yet. Knight e4 is typical of this variation. If black can exchange off knight for bishop, then that's a definite positive. So the bishop really has to, on d2, has to move. If bishop f4, then this is rather typical for this whole variation, that actually you can drive the bishop back with this g-pawn and then flip the knight back to d6 and maybe knight f5, and there's some pressure here. And in combination with g4 and maybe bishop f6. Carlsen played something very similar to this against Ulyanov in Tata Steel last year, actually. So bishop not best on f4, so Aronian played bishop e3. And here, I think I'd have been interested in f5. So black sets up typical stonewall pawn formation. But here, to me, that bishop looks as though it could be a little bit vulnerable on e3, because after bishop d6 and f4, black is already starting an attack on the king side. And this knight, while the pawn chain remains like this, that knight is somewhat out of play. So, for example, if white ever trades here, then of course you want to recapture with the e-pawn, and these squares are still controlled. I mean, exchanging isn't very good. So I think that's the way to go. I mean, maybe bishop d6 afterwards, maybe bishop f6. But of course, it's a very unbalanced position. But maybe not quite to Giri's taste. Now, instead of that, Giri exchanged off bishop for knight. Well, that damages white's pawn structure, but it does give up that beautiful dark square bishop that controls so many crucial squares in the position, in particular g5 and d6. And knight d6. Well, Giri's idea was to try and conquer this square on c4. So, for example, if white were to exchange, and let's say play bishop f4, well, Aronian said he considered this, but that knight finds a pretty good square here. Of course, white can try and open things up, but maybe even just something. You don't have to take this pawn, of course, but maybe something like knight b6, or perhaps rook e8, followed by knight f8, and I think black is reasonably solid there. But Aronian spotted another idea. He played c5. Now, if the knight comes to f5, then bishop f4, and white is looking to play g4, followed by bishop d6. Then black starts to feel the lack of that dark square bishop. But Giri played the knight into c4. Well, if this knight remains there, then black, has reasonable chances. But very quickly, after a matter of seconds, Aronian chopped off this knight. And this is a beautiful exchange sacrifice. A long-term positional exchange sacrifice. So why is white doing this? Well, he has a big space advantage, this pawn on c5. Black's remaining pieces, minor pieces, the bishop on c8 in particular, are very poor. In fact, the rooks are very poor. They need open files. It's hard to get them. And this bishop is going to be a monster, as we'll see. And black has to be careful straight away. Absolutely typical in the Catalan that when the queen stands on this diagonal, then knight g5 is often an interesting move. So, for example, e5 here, which is the move that black would like to play to break open the centre and get the bishop on c8 into play, would be met by knight g5, threatening mate. Now f5 is clearly ludicrous after queen c4, so g6, and now the knight spins back to e4, and well, these dark squares around the king are just so weak. Tremendous position for white. So Giri played h6, understandably. And now just queen c4. Now it's essential that black tries to get out the bishop on c8, so b6. And now bishop f4. So this bishop is just a fantastic piece, just establishing itself in the heart of black's position. And actually this bishop controls both rooks. This is the problem, that black simply cannot get his rook to the b file to get counterplay. Now, I mean, I was slightly surprised by Aronian's next move, but so interesting that he didn't reflect for very long at all over his next move, which was knight e5. You know, he's a real artist, actually. You know, it just kind of flowed from this position. He has a real feel for it. I was expecting something like a4, and that followed by rook b1, just to completely squash the queen side and then turn attention to the king side. You know, maybe even advancing this pawn to e5 to create a big pawn wedge, advancing the h pawn, switching the bishop round to this diagonal. I mean, the king side is eventually where white wants to attack. But Aronian very coolly just played knight e5, which slightly simplifies the position. But he said, you're showing your opponent he's in the frying pan. You show him who's the boss. So basically, Aronian said, you know, he's not afraid to exchange pieces because, in a way, this simplifies matters and just shows black that it's even possible to do this, to simplify, and you still have a completely dominating position, which is true, actually. Okay, let me zip through the final moves. I mean, you know, other moves are possible. Bishop a6 was possible here, but it doesn't really change the assessment of the position. That bishop really doesn't have too much freedom, and black is going to be tied down to the pawn on c6. Giri played rook a7. Queen c3, nice move, attacking the pawn on g7. So that forces a little weakness in black's king side, not just these squares here, but also the pawn on e6 is weaker. So it just starts the process of opening up black's king. And, well, after bishop a8, I mean, this is absolutely terrible. Reminds me of a game that Karpov played against Joël Lautier, which was, I think, also could have been a Catalan or maybe a Queen's Indian. Similar opening, anyway, where Lautier's bishop was just completely stuck on a8. A wonderful game, actually. Karpov Lautier, I think from maybe 95, something like that. I'll have to look it up. Okay. I think it was Linares from memory. Okay, now my mind is working on that. So the bishop switches. Excellent strategy, looking at this diagonal, also potentially looking at this diagonal as well. So Aronian is preparing for the final attack, and here we go. e4 starts to open up the diagonals towards black's king, and if you think about it, you know, this bishop needs to be over here defending the light squares. This is just murderous. I mean, terrible position. And again, this next move shows what an artist Aronian is. How many of us would just hack off that pawn, because black doesn't really have any counterplay here, but no. Aronian, so cool. He just played queen c4. Just keeping up the pressure. Threatening to take on f5. King went in the corner to avoid that. Rook e1 again, reinstating this threat because of the pin. Queen d3 lining up for the big hit. Well, I mean, the threat is to take on f5, trade on e8, and then take on f5 with the queen. So Giri played f4, but this is in vain. That's a free pawn. This doesn't really help. Queen switched over, hitting the rook. Makes it very difficult for black to get counterplay. Giri sacked back the exchange, but I mean, he's completely lost here. Let's just go to the end. With the bishop on a8, it's unsurprising that black is lost. Now, he could play queen c7 here to cover the 7th rank, but once the queen invades, this is hopeless. So like this, and you take. After queen c5, it's now a forced win. Rook d7 hits the pawn on g7, Then bishop b3 hits the rook. Of course, rook can't move because of the mate. And, well, black just has a couple of checks at the other end of the board, but it's lost. Okay, you've got to watch out for this one. Of course, you can't take the rook yet because of the back rank, but h4 solves that problem. Played after precisely 4 seconds by Aronian. He had it all calculated out. And he can just take the rook. Okay, there's a few checks at the other end of the board, but the king is about to escape. And in this position, Giri resigned. If you have one more check, then king there will do the job nicely. Wow, what a game. What an extraordinary game. Aronian is so cool in such situations. You know, it doesn't faze him to sacrifice material. Sometimes at the board, I think this coolness crosses over into casualness. We've seen that with some of his mistakes earlier in the tournament, but today it was absolutely perfect.